There was a time when one company built America's homes, filled them with appliances, insured the cars parked outside, and financed the credit cards in every wallet inside. At its peak, this one retailer accounted for roughly 1% of the entire American economy. If you were alive in the middle of the 20th century, you very likely slept in a bed it sold you, cooked on a stove it built, wore clothes it stitched, and lived in a house you ordered from its catalog, delivered in pieces by rail. This is the story of Sears. However, this is not just a story about how a company built the middle class. This is a story about how that same company was slowly, deliberately, and then catastrophically taken apart until the name that once meant everywhere came to mean almost nowhere at all. Its downfall wasn't a single dramatic collapse. It was something closer to a bleed out, dragged across 3 decades. And by the time it reached its final chapter in a Delaware bankruptcy courtroom, a company that once employed hundreds of thousands of people had been reduced, quite literally, to a handful of stores you'd have to go looking for. To understand how something this big could end this small, we have to go back to 1886, to a train station in the middle of Minnesota. Richard Warren Sears was 22 years old and working as a railroad station agent in North Redwood, Minnesota, a job he had taken because his father, once a wealthy man, had lost everything in bad speculation and died when Richard was only 17. Richard was the oldest child. He had a mother and sisters depending on him, and a station agent's salary wasn't much to depend on. One day, a local jeweler refused to accept a shipment of gold watches that had arrived unordered. Rather than send them back, Richard bought the whole box himself. He sold them to other station agents up and down the rail line at a markup, and within 6 months, he had made about $5,000, more money than most working men saw in several years. He quit the railroad, and the R.W. Sears Watch Company was born. This decision would set the tone for the rest of his career: find a niche nobody else was serving properly and sell into it aggressively. In 1887, Richard needed someone who could actually repair the watches he was selling, and he hired a Chicago watchmaker named Alva Curtis Roebuck. Roebuck was quiet and meticulous, everything Richard wasn't. Richard was the salesman, the copywriter, the hustler, with an instinct for what rural Americans wanted and weren't getting. Together in 1893, they incorporated as Sears, Roebuck and Company. And here is the part that made all the difference. At the time, rural America, which was most of America, was at the mercy of local general stores that could charge whatever they wanted because there was no alternative. Sears. Roebuck's catalog changed that math completely. Mail a farmer in Nebraska a 400-page book listing every price in black and white, let the United States Postal Service and later Rural Free Delivery carry it to his mailbox, and suddenly that farmer had leverage he had never had before. The catalog wasn't just a shopping tool, it was a quiet redistribution of power away from local monopolies and into the hands of ordinary people, and it worked spectacularly. By 1894, the catalog was over 300 pages. By the early 1900s, Sears was mailing millions of them a year, and rural households were referring to it, half-jokingly, as the consumer's Bible. But Richard Sears was a phenomenal marketer and a genuinely poor operator, and by the early 1900s, the company's growth had outpaced its ability to actually fulfill orders. Warehouses were chaotic, orders were getting lost. The business that Richard had willed into existence through sheer salesmanship was at real risk of collapsing under its own weight. This is where Julius Rosenwald enters the story, and it's worth pausing on him, because without Rosenwald, there may not have been a Sears left to eventually fall. Rosenwald, a clothing manufacturer who'd become a part owner of the company in 1895, brought something Richard never had: operational discipline. He restructured the mail order plant, implemented systems for tracking inventory and orders that were, for their time, genuinely revolutionary. Some historians credit Sears' Chicago fulfillment operation with laying groundwork that modern logistics companies still echo. Under Rosenwald's steady hand, the chaos turned into a machine, and the machine printed money. Rosenwald's ambitions, it turned out, went well beyond spreadsheets and shipping schedules. In 1910, he read Booker T. Washington's autobiography and began a partnership that had nothing directly to do with selling watches or washing machines. Together, Rosenwald and Washington built what became known as the Rosenwald Schools. More than 5,000 schoolhouses constructed across 15 southern states for black children who had little or no access to public education, funded in part by Rosenwald's growing Sears fortune, and matched, school by school, by the labor and savings of the black communities that would use them. Over 600,000 students would pass through those classrooms before the program wound down in the 1940s. Among them, a young Maya Angelou and a future congressman named John Lewis. It's a strange thing to sit with. A company built on selling stoves and catalogs, quietly helping educate a third of the black children in the segregated South, almost as a side project to the man running its warehouses. By 1906, Sears, Roebuck and Company went public, one of the first major mail-order retailers to do so, and the growth kept compounding. Richard Sears, restless and increasingly out of step with the more disciplined direction Rosenwald was taking the company, retired from active management in 1908 at just 44 years old. He would die 6 years later, in 1914, from Bright's disease, a kidney ailment, having watched the company he founded become something bigger than his own instincts could have built alone. Alva Roebuck's story took a quieter, stranger turn. Uneasy with Richard's appetite for risk, he'd already sold his own stake back to the company for around $20,000 in 1895, a fraction of what it would eventually be worth, and drifted into other ventures, including a movie projector company and a stint running a typewriter manufacturer. He lost most of what he had left in the 1929 stock market crash, in a small irony that the company itself leaned into for decades. Sears quietly rehired the man whose own name was on its storefronts, bringing him back in 1933 to work for a modest wage and appear at store openings as a living piece of company history. Roebuck died in 1948 at 84, having outlived his former partner by 34 years and having watched the company that once couldn't afford to keep him become the largest retailer on the planet. Under Rosenwald and the leadership that followed him, Sears didn't just survive. It became something closer to American infrastructure. In 1925, the company opened its first retail storefront, a genuine gamble, since the entire business had been built on the idea that customers never needed to see a store at all. It paid off. Over the next decade, Sears would open hundreds of stores across the country, positioning itself in the anchor spot of nearly every regional shopping district in America. And then it started building brands that would outlive most of the executives who created them. Allstate Insurance was launched in 1931, named after a tire brand Sears already sold, and it began by insuring cars, literally handing out policies through the catalog. Kenmore appliances arrived, exclusive to Sears, engineered in-house, and would go on to become one of the most trusted names in American kitchens and laundry rooms. Craftsman tools followed the same model, exclusive, dependable, backed by a lifetime warranty that turned into a point of genuine pride for generations of American fathers and grandfathers. By the middle of the century, Sears wasn't competing with other retailers so much as functioning as a kind of parallel economy. You could buy your house from Sears, literally, as a mail-order kit shipped by rail and assembled on-site. One of more than 70,000 Sears modern homes built between 1908 and 1940. You could finance that house's furnishings with a Sears credit account. You could insure it with Allstate. You could fix it with Craftsman tools bought at the Sears store down the street, and you could do your laundry in a Kenmore machine you'd paid off in installments. Few companies in American history have ever wrapped themselves around a customer's life this completely. And by 1969, Sears was the largest retailer on earth. Its name recognized more or less universally across the country. There was also a softer, more sentimental piece of the empire that mattered just as much as the hardware. Starting in 1933, Sears published a separate holiday catalog known as the Christmas Wish Book, and for generations of American kids, its arrival in the mailbox each fall was something close to a national ritual. Dog-eared, circled in crayon, fought over between siblings deciding what to ask for. It's easy to underestimate how much emotional real estate a company can occupy simply by being present at that specific recurring moment in a family's year, decade after decade. But Sears understood it and leaned into it for over 60 years. That dominance got a physical monument in 1973, when Sears completed its new corporate headquarters in Chicago. At 108 stories and 1,450 feet, the Sears Tower was, for a quarter century, the tallest building in the world. It wasn't just an office building. It was a flex, a literal skyline-defining statement that this company, built from a box of unwanted watches and a station agent's hustle, had become one of the most powerful commercial institutions the country had ever produced. However, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, a company this large, this diversified, this entrenched in the daily habits of American life had also become something else without quite realizing it. Slow. The same scale that made Sears untouchable in 1970 would make it desperately difficult to turn in any new direction by 1990. You see, dominance has a way of feeling permanent right up until the moment it isn't, and Sears' moment was closer than anyone inside the company wanted to admit. Sears had spent nearly a century building trust through consistency. The same brands, the same catalog, the same stores in the same familiar layout, decade after decade. What that consistency didn't prepare the company for was a new kind of competitor that wasn't trying to out-Sears Sears. It was trying to make Sears' entire model look outdated. And in 1990, that competitor passed it. That year, Walmart, still headquartered in rural Arkansas and barely 3 decades old, surpassed Sears as the largest retailer in the United States. It wasn't close for long either. Walmart's lower overhead, big box, everyday low price model was simply built for a different economic era than Sears' department store format, with its unionized workforces, aging urban and suburban locations, and heavier cost structure. Sears' leadership had known this reckoning was coming for years. They had not meaningfully prepared for it. By January of 1993, the company that had built rural America's shopping habits around a printed catalog announced it would discontinue that same catalog entirely. The Big Book, as employees called it, was gone, along with 50,000 jobs and 113 stores. It was a strange, almost poetic irony. The very format Sears had invented to democratize commerce for isolated Americans was killed off by the company itself, because it could no longer justify the cost of printing it. Sears would spend the following 2 decades searching for an identity, part department store, part appliance retailer, part struggling financial conglomerate. selling off pieces of itself along the way. Discover Card, which Sears had launched in 1985 to extend credit to its own catalog shoppers, was spun off in the early 1990s. Allstate, once a wholly owned Sears subsidiary, was fully divested by 1995. The company that had once wrapped itself around every part of a customer's life was, one asset sale at a time, unwrapping itself. Little did most customers know, walking into a Sears Auto Center for a routine brake job in the early 1990s, that they'd stumbled into the company's first real crack in public trust. In June of 1992, California's Department of Consumer Affairs revealed the results of an undercover investigation into Sears automotive repair shops. In 34 of 37 test visits, service advisors had recommended unnecessary repairs, brake calipers, shock absorbers, springs, and master cylinders that undercover investigators' own mechanics confirmed were in perfectly good condition. Customers had been overcharged by as much as $550 apiece. It turned out Sears had put its auto service advisors on commission, tied directly to how many repairs they upsold, and 41 state attorneys general eventually opened their own investigations into the same pattern. Sears settled without admitting wrongdoing, took its advisors off commission, and paid millions in fines and reimbursements. Nobody died. No fortune was stolen outright. But for a company whose entire 100-year reputation had been built on the plain, honest promise printed at the top of every catalog page, satisfaction guaranteed or your money back, it was the first unmistakable sign that the machine Julius Rosenwald had built so carefully was starting to prioritize the numbers over the promise. It would not be the last time. Sears' revenue, which had crested near $60 billion in the early 1990s, would spend the next 2.5 decades sliding, unevenly but persistently, downward. And it was into this weakened, wandering version of Sears, a company still enormous by most standards, but no longer certain what it was for, that a hedge fund manager named Eddie Lampert would eventually walk. Eddie Lampert's own story before Sears had genuine substance to it. Born in 1962 in Roslyn, New York, he was 14 when his father, an attorney, died suddenly. His mother took a job at Saks Fifth Avenue to keep the family afloat, and young Eddie worked weekends and after school in warehouses, stocking shelves and filling orders. The same unglamorous retail labor that decades later he would be accused of treating with contempt. He excelled academically despite it, graduating summa cum laude in economics from Yale, where he studied under Nobel laureate James Tobin, and landing a job in Goldman Sachs' risk arbitrage desk, working alongside a young Robert Rubin, the future Treasury Secretary. Rubin warned him against striking out on his own. Lampert did it anyway, founding the hedge fund ESL Investments in 1988 at just 25 years old. For over a decade, ESL performed spectacularly, and Lampert built a reputation as a disciplined value investor, sometimes compared not always favorably to Warren Buffett. He had, by most honest accounts, a genuinely sharp financial mind. But the skill that had made him brilliant at buying undervalued securities would prove to be a very different skill from the one required to run a retail company that employed hundreds of thousands of people and served millions of customers a week. And in 2002, when ESL began quietly buying up distressed debt in a bankrupt Kmart, that distinction hadn't yet been tested. Lampert took Kmart out of bankruptcy in 2003 through a maneuver that was, in its own narrow way, brilliant. Rather than restructuring Kmart's operations, he used its real estate, hundreds of valuable store locations, as leverage, and within 2 years had orchestrated something bigger. In 2005, Kmart acquired Sears, Roebuck and Company for $11 billion, forming Sears Holdings Corporation, with Lampert as chairman and, eventually, chief executive officer. To be fair, Lampert wasn't wrong that both companies were struggling and that a merger, handled well, could theoretically create scale advantages neither had alone. The idea itself wasn't insane. What happened next is where the story turns. Because from the outside, and increasingly from the inside, Lampert didn't seem to be running Sears Holdings like a retailer at all. He ran it like a portfolio. He split the company into more than 30 semi-autonomous internal business units, each required to negotiate with the others as though they were separate companies competing for the same corporate resources. A structure inspired by his admiration for free market economics that former executives would later describe as turning the company's own departments into rivals instead of teammates. Marketing units fought with merchandising units over budget. Store maintenance was starved of investment. Employees who'd spent decades under the Sears name watched stores grow visibly shabbier. Broken escalators left broken for months, understocked shelves, roofs that leaked onto the same Kenmore washers the company had once been so proud of. Meanwhile, Lampert's own hedge fund, ESL, was Sears Holdings' largest shareholder, and also, increasingly, its lender, extending loans to the company he chaired, secured against its own assets, at interest rates that benefited ESL directly. He had no idea, or perhaps every idea, that this arrangement would eventually draw exactly the kind of scrutiny that follows a person in that position when the company finally collapses. Little did most Sears shareholders and employees know, watching store closures accelerate through the 2010s, that some of the company's most valuable remaining assets were already being carved away and placed somewhere Lampert's hedge fund could reach them more easily than ordinary creditors could. In 2015, Sears spun off 235 of its store properties, including some of its most profitable retail locations, into a separate real estate investment trust called Seritage Growth Properties. Lampert was Seritage's chairman. Sears would now rent back the very stores it had once owned outright, paying rent to a landlord effectively controlled by its own CEO. It's the kind of arrangement that, described plainly, sounds almost too clean to be a coincidence, because, as later litigation would allege, it wasn't one. You might expect the story of a 130-year-old American institution to end with some kind of external villain, a foreign competitor, a recession, a technology nobody saw coming. And to be fair, e-commerce genuinely hurt Sears. Amazon's rise through the 2000s and the 2010s battered every traditional retailer, and Sears was especially vulnerable given how much of its business relied on customers physically walking into aging stores. But that explanation, while true, isn't the whole one, and it's not even the most important part of it. What nobody inside Sears headquarters wanted to say out loud for years was that the company's terminal decline wasn't happening to it. In important, well-documented ways, it was being done to it by the man sitting at the head of its own boardroom table. By 2016, credit rating agencies had downgraded Sears Holdings' debt so far into junk territory that some analysts stopped bothering to model a recovery scenario at all. Store closures, once occasional, became a monthly ritual, the kind of press release retail journalists could set their watches to. Sears' own CEO, in September of 2018, would publicly blame the company's pension obligations to 100,000 retirees for its financial strain, a claim that struck many longtime employees, watching their former employer's final months play out as a strange thing to say about a company that had, by their account, been quietly gutted from the inside for over a decade. October 15, 2018. Sears Holdings Corporation filed for Chapter 11, bankruptcy protection in the U.S. Bankruptcy Court, for for the Southern District of New York. Eddie Lampert stepped down as CEO that same day, though he remained chairman. The filing listed roughly $7 billion in assets against more than $11 billion in debt, a company that, in 1969, had been the largest retailer on the planet, employing over 350,000 people at its historic peak, closed its books that day with fewer than 70,000 employees left, and a stock that had once traded near $60 a share, worth pennies. There was no dramatic final scene, no single point of collapse you could point a camera at, just a filing, a courtroom, and a company that had quietly become a shell of the institution that once redistributed economic power to the entire American countryside. What followed was, in some ways, harder to watch than the bankruptcy filing itself. Executive bonuses, totaling over $25 million, were approved for a small group of Sears leaders, even as tens of thousands of workers, like Andrea Patrick, a Kmart employee in Rockford, Illinois, who lost her job when her store closed that same October, went into the holidays with severance packages that barely covered a month's expenses. Roughly 90,000 workers would lose their jobs across the company's final rounds of closures. For many of them, it wasn't just a paycheck disappearing. It was decades of identity tied up in a company name that had meant something to their parents and grandparents too. The retirees were arguably hit hardest of all. An estimated 100,000 former Sears employees were depending on pension and life insurance benefits the company had frozen back in 2006 but never fully funded. Advocacy groups like the National Association of Retired Sears Employees, representing roughly 60,000 of them, spent the bankruptcy process fighting simply to make sure their modest monthly checks and small life insurance policies, often in the range of $8,000 to $10,000, meant to cover a funeral, would survive the company's restructuring at all. And it wasn't only the people on the payroll who felt it. For 100 years, a Sears store had functioned as the anchor tenant of the shopping mall or downtown business district it sat in, the store that pulled foot traffic to every smaller shop around it. When a Sears closed, it rarely closed alone. Malls across the country lost their anchor and, within a few years, lost the smaller tenants that had depended on that anchor's foot traffic too, part of a broader retail collapse of the 2010s that industry writers had already started calling the retail apocalypse, well before Sears' own bankruptcy filing made the phrase feel prophetic rather than dramatic. Entire town squares that had organized themselves, quite literally, around where the Sears sat, were left with a dark, empty anchor building and a parking lot too big for whatever eventually limped in to replace it, if anything ever did. Then, in April of 2019, came the lawsuit that made the quiet accusations of the previous decade explicit and public. Sears Holdings, now operating under bankruptcy oversight, sued its own former chairman, Eddie Lampert, along with his hedge fund ESL Investments and several former Sears directors, including, notably, Stephen Mnuchin, who by then was serving as United States Treasury Secretary and had previously sat on Sears's board. The lawsuit accused Lampert and ESL of fraudulently transferring more than $2 billion in company assets to themselves in the years leading up to the bankruptcy, including the undervaluation of real estate beneath 266 of Sears' most profitable stores by at least $649 million, before that real estate was arranged into leaseback deals that benefited ESL, and the 2014 spin-off of Land's End, a Sears-owned clothing brand structured specifically, the suit alleged, to preserve Lampert's stake rather than accept a $1.6 billion buyout offer that would have delivered more value to the company and its ordinary creditors. Lampert denied the allegations, calling them categorically false, and his attorneys argued every transaction had been reviewed and approved by independent directors and outside advisors at the time. To be fair, corporate boards did sign off on these deals, and untangling exactly how much true independence those directors had from a chairman who was simultaneously the company's largest shareholder and, later, one of its principal creditors, was never going to be simple, and reasonable people looking at the same facts have drawn different conclusions about where negligence ends and self-dealing begins. But in December of 2022, after years of litigation, Lampert and his co-defendants agreed to a settlement, paying $175 million to resolve the claims. Not an admission of guilt, but not nothing either, for a case Lampert's own lawyers had once dismissed as baseless. By then, the physical remnants of the empire were nearly gone. The Sears Tower itself, the 108-story monument to the company's 1973 dominance, had already been sold off in 2004 and formally renamed the Willis Tower in 2009, years before the company that built it would even file for bankruptcy, as though the skyline had quietly taken the name down before the story underneath it was finished. Transformco, the holding company Lampert created to absorb what remained of Sears and Kmart after the bankruptcy sale, took over roughly 425 stores in 2019. It began closing them almost immediately. By the mid-2020s, that number had fallen into the single digits. 5 Sears stores remained by the end of 2025. Aging locations kept open more out of momentum than strategy, including one store in Florida that had been continuously operating since 1954, quietly outliving nearly everything else the company had ever built around it. So, was Eddie Lampert a financial genius who inherited a company already dying of self-inflicted wounds, or was he the man who finished the job for personal gain while it was too weak to stop him? The honest answer, based on everything the record actually shows, is probably both, in different measures at different times, and that tension is part of what makes this story land the way it does. Sears was genuinely struggling. Before Lampert ever bought a share of Kmart's debt, Walmart had already outcompeted it. E-commerce was already reshaping retail, and decades of underinvestment had already left the company brittle. Lampert didn't invent Sears' vulnerability, but the specific way it died, not through a swift, honest failure, but through a slow, structured extraction of value into the hands of the very people responsible for saving it, was, by the weight of the evidence and a court-supervised settlement, substantially his doing. Some of what Sears built has genuinely outlived it. Discover, once a Sears experiment to extend credit to catalog shoppers, is now a standalone financial company worth tens of billions of dollars. Allstate remains one of the largest insurers in the country. Craftsman Tools sold off to Stanley Black, and Decker in 2017 still sit in garages across America, most of their owners never stopping to think about which company engineered the ratchet in their hand. Kenmore, too, still exists as a licensed brand, its name recognized by people who have never set foot in a Sears store and never will. But the company itself, the actual retailer, the one that once employed more Americans than almost any private business in the country's history, the one whose catalog quietly rebalanced economic power for generations of rural families who had never had another option, that company no longer meaningfully exists. What's left is 5 buildings, a licensing arrangement for a handful of brand names, and a $175 million settlement that will never come close to accounting for what 100,000 retirees and hundreds of thousands of laid-off workers actually lost. Richard Sears built something out of a box of unwanted watches because he refused to let his family's poverty define his future. Alva Roebuck lived long enough to watch the company that once couldn't afford to keep him become the biggest retailer in the world, and never seemed to resent it for a day. Julius Rosenwald turned that hustle into an institution disciplined enough to last a century, and generous enough to help build a third of the schoolhouses serving Black children across the segregated South, almost as an afterthought to running a catalog business. And in the end, it took one man with a genuinely brilliant financial mind, operating a company he never seemed to love the way its founders had, to take 130 years to build something and roughly 15 to take it apart. That's not a redemption story. There's no third act here where the name comes roaring back. No scrappy new owner who buys the trademark and rebuilds something worthy of it. What's left of Sears exists mostly in the past tense now, in the Craftsman wrench still sitting in a garage somewhere, in a Kenmore fridge still humming in a kitchen. It was never meant to outlive. In the faded outline of an anchor store on a mall directory, nobody's bothered to update. It's just what happened, documented plainly in bankruptcy filings and a settlement check to a name that used to hang above the door of nearly every town in America, and to the 100,000 people still waiting on a pension check from a company that, in every way that matters, isn't really there to send it anymore.